All right, so good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're coming from. I know many of you are coming from around the world as well, so just wanted to welcome all of you to CESA's very first ever free in public California Energy Storage Alliance Energy Storage Virtual Conference. I'm Jano. I'm the Senior Policy Manager for the California Energy Storage Alliance, CESA, and I'm pleased to be here with you today. The purpose of these events are to facilitate learning, policy development, and networking opportunities for the energy storage community, both within California and beyond, and we are glad you're able to join us. And then if we go to the next slide, just wanted to share, many of you have joined this session with Jagerson from Malta, where we're going to discuss long duration energy storage markets and applications, what happens after 100% renewables. As many states start to, and countries, frankly, start to position themselves to meet long-term 100% renewable objectives. I think it's critical to start beginning to think through and converse about whether we have all the resources and tools in the toolkit that can help us achieve our goals. And so with that, I just wanted to provide a brief introduction to CESA, who's helping host and organize these webinars. We're a over 10-year nonprofit membership-based advocacy group, and we're focused on developing and really facilitating the market for energy storage in California to achieve the state's decarbonization goals, as well as to ensure reliability and sustainability for all Californians. Just as a snapshot of some of the members that we represent, CESA has over 80 members, which span, the wide ecosystem of energy storage, ranging from technology providers to, developers to system integrators, as well as controls and technology and software providers. So we span the whole gamut of the ecosystem, and CESA overall continues to advance a technology and business model neutral market, and CESA is supported solely by the contributions and coordinated activities of its members, of which Malta is one. So thank you, Malta team. So with that, I wanted to kind of set the stage for today's webinar presentation, where I wanted to discuss a little bit about what California's planners are thinking about in terms of long duration storage. As a Californian, I don't want to how California is really leading the nation and leading the world in decarbonization policies and storage, but I think in many ways we are where we're seeing advances in the storage market over the past 10 years. And we're starting to see a greater need as we advance further and further, that we need to think through how we can grow the pie and ensure that all different types of storage are able to be developed and deployed to address emerging needs. Increasingly, as we advance toward our decarbonization goals, we're seeing planners recognize the value and need for long duration storage in particular. Even though in the near term, lithium ion storage has done a great job in getting the overall market started and getting people familiar with the concept and asset class of storage. As we look further ahead to 2030 and 2045, 2050, we're seeing regulators, system planners really focus on long duration need. This is just a chart of one example where in LA, where they also have a 100% objective, and they have unique kind of distribution and transmission infrastructure issues, where they're seeing, there is a huge value in really recognizing and transforming the market for long duration. And so they're already in the process of starting to look through as they look at 2030, 2045 goals, what they can do. And this is just one example where they look across the different seasons and recognize that long duration storage is needed. In this graph specifically, CSP, concentrated solar power, is being served as a proxy for long duration storage. And as you can see across all the seasons, you're seeing a significant need for 8 to 12-hour storage systems. On the next slide, you can see from a broader statewide perspective how long duration storage is being recognized. In 2030 GHG scenario modeling, they've basically identified 1,605 megawatts of pump hydro storage or similar long duration storage being needed to achieve our GHG objectives by 2030, as well as to ensure reliability. And in this model, it's representing pump hydro storage in particular, but they're using that as a proxy for just general 8 to 12-hour long duration needs. And so I think across these two modeling exercises, you can kind of see the value of long duration as being needed, even though as we are still in the early stages of how to model long duration technologies. We're going to advance further to be able to identify specific technologies, specific characteristics of different long duration technologies that could better be reflected in these models to highlight some of those differences, given long duration storage is a broad asset subclass of the storage industry. And I think I'll end with a point that long duration storage is really entering the conversation of the ISO and grid planners, where they've explicitly stated in public comments that they recognize that the storage industry needs to evolve to recognize long duration and to transform and diversify the storage fleet to better enable us in achieving our long-term decarbonization objectives. And so Malta is just one of those companies, one of those leading companies that are pioneering a long duration technology. And so I'm happy to kick it off to Ty. But before I do so, I just wanted to do a quick housekeeping item to be sure that everyone is engaged and plugged in and has no issues. All participants are currently in listen only mode. And so if you want to submit questions, you can always submit questions through the chat box or raise your hand to indicate that you have a question that you would like to ask. A common question that I'm getting across all these sessions is that, is this webinar being recorded? Can I get the PowerPoint? And I believe it is. Ty, can you confirm with me?
That's a great question. I would have spent more time on makeup if I'd known it was being recorded, but I think, I don't know, it's a good question, but we can certainly share the deck.
Yeah. Let's leave it as TBD, but at least the deck will be at minimum available. And so with that, I'll kick it over to Ty Jagerson, VP of Commercialization at Malta, to kick off the presentation.
Great, thank you, Jen. First of all, shout out to CESA for putting together this event. There's a lot of really good talks that have been going on, and we're proud to be part of such an illustrious group here. Another quick note is, as we were gearing up for this presentation, it was really interesting seeing who's attending this list. I think right now we've got over 130 people on this call right now, and there were maybe 400, 500 people that expressed interest in the survey of this particular session. And I think it really speaks well to what even a few years ago was a non-existent sector. And the folks that are on this call right now include people from utilities and regulators, startups, established companies, and folks from a lot of different countries. So this is a really exciting time in this sector. We think we've got a good product, but there's a lot of really cool companies that are reaching out and building interesting innovations in this space. So hopefully we can shed a little light on where we think everything's heading, and specifically talk a little bit about this particular nuance around the 100% renewables revolution and the state of that, and then what comes next. So we'll talk about the idea, what is 100% renewable, and I'll give you a quick intro to Malta. And then we'll talk generally about the storage, long duration, and hybrid energy storage solutions. Talk a little bit about applications, revenue models, and what's next. So the first thing I want to do is start with this idea of 100% renewables. And I remember the first time I heard someone say in a public forum from a podium, the idea that they were pursuing 100% renewables. It was only like 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And at the time, I remember thinking, this is an extraordinary political liability for this person who's the head of a large organization to be saying that they're going to be doing this. And this wasn't Google, this was the head of a conservative Republican geography. And I think in the last several years, it's gone from fringe idea to something that is very commonplace. In fact, the idea of being 100% renewables is so commonplace these days that it spans geographies, organization types, and as a marketing tool, which is one of the reasons a lot of people say, we're going 100% renewables, we are leaders in the renewables revolution. It's really hard to get purchased these days by saying you're 100% renewables because a lot of folks are doing it. But the reality behind 100% renewables as an idea is that it's not really that. 100% renewables is typically used in the context of making sure that at the end of a given period, let's say at the end of a year, you have both consumed directly renewable energy resources, and then you've also consumed, when you didn't have access to renewable energy resources, you've also consumed energy from the grid that comes from, for example, coal or natural gas. And then at the end of the year, you go and you buy enough renewable credits, or you buy credits at the beginning of the year, and then you make up for the fact that you consumed carbon-based energy with renewable energy credits, which are purchased by somebody that had extra renewable energy from Montana or from a wind farm somewhere else. And what's happened is people have started to realize that in a lot of cases that doesn't actually help wean you off of carbon sourced energy. What it does is it just means that the gas peakers and the coal plants are being paid more money to operate a few less of the time, but they still have to be there because we don't have the access to renewable energy during 24/7, all the time, 365 days a year. And so this idea of being 100% renewables has come and established itself in the mainstream. And yet the idea is also now being superseded by what we call 24/7 renewable energy or coincident renewable energy. And that's really where we think this energy industry is going. And what we're starting to see is the initial signals in the market from well-established players who are investing not just millions, but billions of dollars into the development of the tools and the resources that are going to make this possible. So I'll speak to each one of these organizations in a couple minutes, but that's really the dynamic that we're trying to illustrate here. And we'll talk a little bit about what does it mean in the existing storage industry today to give you the context. But that's really the takeaway, is that we are on the cusp of a new era in not just storage, but in renewable energy, because what we'll try to show you today is that we really can't get to a true 100% renewable energy ecosystem without long duration storage. This is not long duration storage against lithium or against pumped hydro or against hydrogen or against something else. It's really about, this is a critical missing piece in the portfolio of renewable energy solutions that includes wind, solar, hydro, lithium, hydrogen, everything else. So I'll tell you a little bit about Malta, and I'll try to not make it too long an advertisement, but this will give you a context of how we fit in the market and what our perspective is on, and why we're involved in the long duration storage space in the first place. So Malta is a molten salt based technology where we store energy from renewable energy resources in big tanks of molten salt. And we store heat in molten salt, and we store cold energy in big vats of antifreeze. And we create that temperature differential using large turbo machinery. We store the energy in the vats, and then when we need the energy again, we recombine it through a different set of turbo machinery and generate electricity that way. We can put our facility, like a lot of storage facilities, we can put our technology at a wind farm or at a solar farm, or we can put it any place in the grid where we have adequate access to these types of renewable energy resources. This is not a technology for your home unless you consume 100 megawatts or more of energy at your home. This really is a utility scale solution, but it's designed to work in tandem with the hundreds and thousands of smart and renewable and distributed resources that are increasingly the backbone for the generation and the intelligence of energy in our ecosystem. We are one of a handful of renewable energy companies that have come onto the market in the last number of years in what is sort of the first explosion of renewable energy solutions focused specifically on long duration solutions. I might say our little portion of the ecosystem is where maybe the lithium industry was 5 to 10 years ago, depending on how you're looking at it. But our projects take years to put in place. So even though there's not a lot of utility scale installations using long duration storage in place right now, these projects are being developed by us and others. And so in the time frame for asset allocation planning of utilities and regulators, this is a now technology, and these projects are being developed and financed starting now. So our plant looks a lot like a thermal plant. It looks a lot like a gas peaker plant. And a lot of the technology we use is familiar to people that operate conventional power plants. There's a couple reasons this is relevant. One is because the technology was designed to take advantage of mature, established technologies. And when we talk about coal a little bit later, we'll talk about how that actually gives us a nice way to support the transition of an ailing industry, and it plays into our market engagement. But the technology is designed to be safe, scalable, reliable, able to be designed in a custom way for different geographies and to be operated in creative ways that we think reflects the requirements of the grid coming forward. And of course, it has to be low cost and deliver good returns for investors. Malta is a spin out from Google X. And that continues to be a really important relationship for us, both for on the energy consumption side and as a data friend. We also have Alpha Laval, the world's largest heat exchanger company in the world, as a participant in the company, and Breakthrough Energy Ventures, and other strong partners, including Concord New Energy, which is an energy developer, and Turbo Machinery Partners. So we are designed to scale. We're engaged in the market, and we have partners that are investing a lot alongside us into getting this capacity into the ground. I won't take too long on this. Basically, we take energy from the grid, we run it through turbo machinery, put it in tanks, and regenerate it again. One of the keys to our technology is that we're scaling on the back of existing solutions in the market, and the idea of storing energy in molten salt is pretty novel for some. Many of you are familiar with it in the context of concentrated solar projects. And just to give you a sense of context, this slide's a couple years old, but in terms of worldwide storage capacity, most storage capacity until recently has all been pumped hydro storage, basically big reservoirs. And everything else was up here in this little category. But from this little category of storage, in the last 10 years or so, most of the energy storage that wasn't pumped hydro was in thermal storage. And so there's gigawatts of this type of energy storage technology out there where the source of the heat, or the source of the energy, was just direct solar energy. So there's a handful of dynamics that are driving the expansion of the storage industry and the emergence of this long duration energy storage component of that industry. And the first one is the accelerating renewables penetration. More wind, more solar. And we'll talk about why that's happening and our perspective on why people generally don't think that it's happening as fast as it is happening. Second thing is climate concerns. We all have this, and it impacts the policy, and it impacts people's daily decisions, and obviously it drives a lot of the stuff we're talking about here. Something a lot of people are unfamiliar with is just economic growth and electrification themselves are drivers of storage and long duration energy storage requirements. And the grid itself has to get rebuilt every 40 years. So every year, just for electrification purposes, you need to reinvest in 1/40th of the global grid ecosystem. And so there's trillions of dollars floating around. And every year, people have to make the decision, well, where does that next $1 trillion goes? And increasingly, those assets are being deployed towards smarter, cleaner, greener, more flexible grid ecosystems. And then beyond that, just the grid itself is aging. So beyond just sort of the annual transition, you're getting failure modes in some grids that are forcing people to think of wholesale retrofit and rebuild of parts of the grid. And all that plays into the dynamic where you're seeing a dramatic change in the makeup of the generating capacity. In this case, this is a graph for the US, but it's true everywhere in the world where, depending on whose forecast you're looking at, there's varying degrees of ascension of wind and solar as part of the solar mix and the decline of coal. And then depending on who you're talking to, nuclear is going to go up or down, and that's probably a different presentation. But the key result of this is that as you get deep levels of renewable penetration, two critical things happen to the grid. One is you get a lot more volatility, and that's represented here. These lines, these green lines are wind volatility, and the red lines, or orange lines, are solar volatility. And you can imagine if this ends up being the dominant source of your energy, it gets harder and harder to control your grid relative to when you can just turn on a gas peak or a coal plant or just leave your nuke running. The other thing that's really interesting is that, and this is an example from the California energy market, from the CESA market, curtailment is going up. And curtailment is just a fancy word for throwing away the useless renewable energy that you can't use at the time and it's generated. This is a recent chart that illustrates how much curtailment there is, and this is very much an exponential line, and you're going to see increasing amounts of this, not just in California, but in all parts of the world. If you look at this particular illustration for CAISO, and you look at the renewable energy penetration levels that are anticipated, you see that there's a very steep increase in the anticipated penetration percentage of renewables. But here's the challenge, is that the amount of renewable energy storage you need as your overall contribution goes up non-linearly. So this type of increase has to be met by a greater increase in amount of renewables storage, because you need to be able to cover more and more different scenarios for volatile situations. One of the things that people often say when we're talking to them in the market is like, geez, I totally get that we're going to need long duration storage at some point, but kind of seems like it's not really there yet, and shouldn't we just wait? And this is an interesting analysis here where it shows, this is analysis done by NREL for a bunch of different energy markets and specific locations in the US. And their assertion is that the blue line is the amount of 4-hour storage that's needed, and then the orange is 6-hour storage, and then the green is the 8-hour storage. And that's what's needed now and for current planning cycles. And the critical thing here is that you don't see a lot of 8-hour, 10-hour, 12, 20-hour storage out there, because those technologies really aren't available yet. Lithium is a fantastic technology. We think long duration energy storage is a really good complement to it. Most people say that lithium is great for 2 to 4 hours. You can extend it to 6 hours. Maybe you can extend it to 8 hours. But with lithium ion solutions, and there's lots of technical background we'd be happy to share with people on this, because of the way the lithium is designed, it's hard to decouple the power that you're delivering and the energy that you're delivering. And so with our thermal system or flow batteries or gravity solutions or whatever, you can decouple the amount of energy you're storing with the amount of power that you need, either for charging or discharging. So this is today, and we think this demand is going to increase. And one representation of this is, as an example, in Germany, as your total penetration level of renewables goes up, you need increasing levels of storage in terms of number of hours of storage. For context, our initial product is going to be a 10-hour solution. We are talking to folks for designing installations that go as long as 96 hours. Some folks in the industry are looking at early long duration storage solutions in the 140-hour range. And each one of those is you would tailor the number of hours and the amount of power according to the geography and the specific location and application that you have. In the storage and renewables industry, the famous graph that people usually refer to is the duck curve. And the duck curve is this line here, which is shaped like a duck because you take the normal energy consumption requirements in a given grid, for example, CAISO. And then when you get a lot of solar coming in the middle of the day, your net load ends up getting a droop like this. And if you look at certain California markets, this droop ends up actually going down here. So you have the risk of dramatic overproduction in these markets. So if you were in the business of selling wind farms or selling solar farms, and that's a 20-year asset, and you're looking at the amount of solar that's going to be deployed in your geography, and you look at what that's going to do to this duck curve 2 years out, 5 years out, 20 years out, you really have to think like, well, geez, my product is going to be producing in an oversupplied market that is expensive. And at times in California, you have negative pricing where you have the cost of electricity is actually negative. It's kind of like oil recently, where if you've got more than you can do something with, you have a pricing version. So lithium is a great solution for dealing with the immediate problem of the duck curve, where you can take some of this energy from the middle of the day and you shift it towards the end of the night, and then you sort of flatten the duck curve. And we think lithium is a great solution for that. As you get more and more lithium on the table in the grid, it flattens out a little bit, but then you have the challenge like, well, how do you extend that renewable energy to supply over, all through the day, into the next day, and then eventually into subsequent days? And that's really the initial applications that we're going for. We're not only looking at shifting it from the middle of the day to the end of the day, but shifting it all the way through the end of the evening. And because we have this flexible charge and discharge ratio, we can pull down extra amounts of really cheap energy in the middle of the day and then paper that out over longer periods of time to help make the total grid much more flexible and resilient in the face of enormous amounts of renewable. So there's a lot of complicated ways to look at this, but one of the simple illustrations is, okay, if you can spend more time charging and get a longer charge cycle, then that gives you a lot of flexibility for how you dispatch. And you can do that on the charge cycle or the discharge cycle. And we'll talk a little bit more about the revenue models associated with this. So there's really a couple different time scales that are relevant. You've got the duck curve alleviation, and then you've got moving into a 2-day regime where you can extend into a full 24-hour cycle. And then increasingly what people need to be able to do is they need to be able to run their grids without any carbon supply for multiple days. And so this is really where, for these initial applications we're talking about, and then as you get into multiple weeks and into months, you start moving into the domain of seasonal storage, which is not really what we're going after. Although if you had a 96-hour long duration energy solution, that might help you combine your resources in order to get to a seasonal solution. But there's other interesting developments out there, like hydrogen might be a good seasonal solution. And again, all these things complement as part of a future grid ecosystem. So there's a lot of different ways to look at the value of a regular storage system or a long duration storage system. The simplest way to think of it is in terms of renewables firming, sort of balancing out your renewables, grid balancing, which is accommodating for all the different chaotic elements on the grid and stabilizing it. And then T&D deferral, which means instead of spending $1 billion on a new transmission line, as you get new loads and new solar, you can use storage at either ends of the potential transmission or distribution line and just buffer your energy that way. In our case, we also generate waste heat. And we have a thermal supply in our system, so we can also go after waste heat applications. But again, the key thing that all these applications are really enabling at the high level is being able to get to a point where we can turn off fossil fuels altogether and get to a truly 100% renewable energy solution. So this is sort of a standard mandatory required market is growing aggressively in all markets around the world slide. And it's useful, but something that's always fascinating for me when you look at these slides is they always start with some sort of exponential curve, and then when you look out in the future, they sort of project out linearly. And for a number of reasons, I think a lot of the models that you see out there are wrong and overly conservative. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to take a couple questions. So first question, did Mr. Jagerson cut his own hair? That's very funny, anonymous. I did. I cut it initially. My wife helped me finish the job. Gravity versus thermal, locationally and application-wise. I think there are potentially applications for gravity types of storage solutions. Pumped hydro is a gravity storage system. And I think that there's a lot of, there's sort of a Cambrian explosion of new technologies out there. I think for gravity, it's hard to beat water, but there's a bunch of creative things going on with pressurized water and everything else. Is thermal more scalable down to distribution level for microgrids? So one of the advantages of our technology is that it goes, the bigger it goes, the more economic it gets. And so we've migrated our core product to a 100 megawatt solution because turbo machinery has demonstrated that it's the most reliable, lowest cost, large scale way to generate power at large scale. So we think that the 100 megawatt domain is the most interesting. We are looking at some thermal applications and some niche applications where down in the 10 megawatt range. So yes, actually, especially when you're combining the power with the thermal loads, it's very interesting. Long question on lithium ion, how molten salt, Yeah, I think, so we love conversations about cost metrics. The number we use for long-term lithium ion costs is sort of $150 in the 20-30 range for a fully installed lithium ion solution, dollars per kilowatt hour. And some people think that's too aggressive in terms of going down too much. We think that's a good target for us to beat, and we're confident that we're going to beat that. Can we be used in microgrid applications? Absolutely, that's something that we're looking at. How scalable is the technology? Can you easily add another 50 megawatts 2 years later? Not easy to add megawatts, but easy to add megawatt hours. When do we expect Malta to have a commercial product at 100 megawatts? Our first commercial installation is scheduled for COD in 2025. And you guys keep adding questions, so I'm losing the battle of catching up with that. So why don't we punt on more of those questions until the end? These are great questions. Please keep these answers coming, and maybe what we'll do is we'll compile a Q&A FAQ LIST after this. So a little time check. So it's 1:33. I promise to get you all out of here on time by 2 California time, and I'll try to end with about 10 minutes for additional Q&A. So what comes next? I think something that is interesting is a lot of the drivers for why we are in a situation where the world needs long duration storage derives from just the unbelievable collapse in the price of solar and wind over the last, not just actually over the last 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but really over the last 30 years. And when I first started doing solar about 20 years ago, there was this fantastic Ray Kurzweil slide that looked back about 30 years. And it took like sort of this dramatic curving cost line and then converted it into a log line. And he drew the line forward about 40 years. And I remember at the time saying, like, that's a really compelling argument, but it has to be wrong because all the analysts are saying something totally different. So this guy's, sort of like weird off the charts. But the more I looked into it, every single year, the log line was right and all the analysts were wrong. And something that I would continue to maintain today is that is still just as true today as it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I teach a class one day a year at Stanford on renewable energy finance, and I've got a chart from 10 years ago that I still use, which is one of those log lines, and you can just move your calendar date every year, and if anything, it's too conservative. But this chart by Raznam is a great updated illustration of that chart. And it says, okay, in 2010, the IEA made this prediction for the future cost of solar, and Ramez a year later said, like, no, you IEA guys are way too conservative. This is really where the curve's going to go. And as you can see from this chart, well, what actually happened is the numbers came down much more than this. This is about the same era when the U.S. Department of Energy came out with the Sunshot program. And at the time they said, we think solar is going to get down to $1 a watt, and we're going to help it get there. And I remember thinking, like, these guys are great guys, but they're losing all credibility because just no one's going to believe it. I didn't believe it. And now we're well below $1. And people continue to say, okay, well, we're there, and that's it. And now the future of solar is going to be based on one of these nominal reduction curves. When in fact, I think the evidence suggests that that a lot of the dynamics that drive that cost are still very much in play. And so this analysis that we continue to see is, I would contest, faulty. And so when you look at the loads for what the US needs, or what the world needs, or what CESA needs for forward projections for long duration storage, you can go back every single year for 15 years and calculate how wrong they were and project that forward and apply that filter when you look at these numbers. And this is maybe the most spectacular about that. And these models continue to be off. And even Ramez in 2015 guessed wrong again, and these numbers continue to be low. So I think that the question now is like, okay, well, what does that mean going forward, and how low is it going to be? This gray line here, this gray area here, is the operating cost for fossil power plants that have already been built, and coal is on the more expensive side, peakers are on the less expensive side. But these plants are increasingly shutting down, and to be honest, gas peakers are really the reason why most of the coal is shutting down. But increasingly, solar and wind are shutting down gas peakers, and that trend is accelerating, and it's doubly accelerating with COVID, because you have a positive marginal cost with those plants and no marginal cost with the wind and the solar. So when you see forward projections coming from anybody about what the storage requirements are, or about what the long duration requirements are, just stop and sort of ask what's the source of and the assumption base under those forward projections. And we'll see projections like this look like, wow, there's going to be a lot of renewable energy, but you just have to stop and check the assumptions. There are political organizations out there that are looking ahead and saying, we need this, we need it now. If you dig into the weeds around a lot of the regulatory bodies who are saying our 4-hour RA requirements or our capacity requirements, market mechanisms are inadequate for the coming boom in renewables, and inadequate for the political commitments being made, or the corporate commitments being made about 100% renewables. And so these changes are in the works today. And 3 years from now, 4 years from now, certainly 5 years from now, when we turn on our first system, the regulatory mechanisms through which storage projects are compensated today will be very different. And you can start to see where these are going when you dig into some of the regulatory dialogue. California, again, definitely a leader in this space, as it's always been. Where goes California probably will go the rest of the world eventually. And they are investing heavily into this and looking at a lot of the benefits. I want to talk for a quick second about hybrid solutions. So people have talked about hybrid energy solutions for a long time, and for a while it was sort of solar and wind combined together, or solar and wind plus lithium. But increasingly, you're going to see hybrid solutions that include long-duration energy storage. And that's not just solar and wind with long-duration storage, but solar and wind with lithium with long-duration energy storage. And the reason for that is because I'm going to sort of zip way back up here. If you look at this curve way up here, in any given multi-day period, you're going to have a need for either long or short period. But as these durations get longer and you need to optimize the economics of your assets, and you chew and do more and more of this oversupply, you're going to need a combination of different resources in order to economically address these requirements. And I think ultimately what you'll also see is not just wind and solar and lithium and long duration storage, but you're also going to see seasonal storage injected in there as well. And I think one of the most interesting candidates for that is hydrogen. Today, you say, like, well, why would you bother with a short duration storage if you can use a long duration storage? And the problem with that is that the energy conversion efficiency of hydrogen storage, where you're using solar to split water to create hydrogen gas, which you can then burn or put into a gas pipeline. The problem with that is the efficiency is too low. And so you really only want to use that when you're more efficient lithium and or long duration storage solutions are sort of capped out on their storage, which is going to happen in markets where you've got super low cost wind and storage. What this means is that these assets are going to become more integrated and more complicated, not just in terms of how they operate, but people will do space. And if you talk to a renewable energy finance entity, call right now, what they'll tell you is it's really difficult. I'm getting a sign that my internet connection is unstable, so I'm going to turn off my video. What they'll tell you is that it's hard to get a good solid financial yield on wind and solar projects today because the costs are coming down so far and because there's so much competition. There aren't a lot of long duration energy storage solutions out there, but they are going to be providing very shortly, and now in development terms, they are going to be able to provide unique capabilities for off-takers and for utilities and IPPs. And so this shortage of supply of long duration energy solutions is going to enable a higher yield for these projects, certainly in the early years, that will compensate for the fact that there are newer technologies coming into the market. So hybrids play a really important role, not just in terms of enabling more renewables, but enabling more that's sort of yield hungry right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about coal, because a lot of folks in our industry are pretty anti-coal, and I'm sympathetic to that. Coal has been a really important part of the ecosystem, and I think it's declining, and I think that's good. There's a lot of resistance to coal declining because these are economic assets owned by economically interested people. There's a lot of people employed by these industries, and there's a lot of people that are dependent on the environments and ecosystems in the towns and the cities where these operates. We believe that long duration energy storage, and distinctly unique from lithium storage, is a really interesting fit for helping with the transition of these coal plants to the clean energy ecosystem. And it doesn't mean that we're trying to prolong the life of these. What it means is that we're giving a graceful transition mechanism for the employees and for the facilities to basically have these coal plants become renewable energy storage plants. And that's really important because you have many, many gigawatts that are retired and many more that are coming down the line. And ultimately, these coal plants are thermal plants. And what we operate is thermal plants. So we can use the labor, we can use some of the facilities, we can use the brownfields, and there's other things that we can do to help basically streamline that process and reduce the resistance to the transition away from coal. So a lot of people are asking, well, geez, what's happening with COVID? Energy prices are coming down. What happens? And I think there's a couple things. First of all, bottom line is I don't think it really changes that much for when we are hitting the market with our first installation, which is in 2025. But it is in a way accelerating the trend line that is going to be dominant in the future, which is the coal and the gas companies are taking a big hit now because they are marginal energy costs, and renewables do not have that. And so a lot of coal plants and gas peakers are being shut down and really hurting the economics and stifling the flow of new capital to these assets. And that in turn generates a boost for the folks that have invested into renewables who are seeing their assets not crater. Something else that's really important is if you scan the news and look at how governments around the world are looking at the post-COVID recovery period, there have been some really interesting proclamations from Europe and from New York and other states in the US and other countries in Asia that a lot of the trillions of dollars of reinvestment and government funding that's going to go into this is going to come in the form of climate change related investments. And that means renewables, but in a lot of these places, one of the biggest barriers to getting more renewables is having long duration energy storage. So it's a really interesting point in time, and we think that it doesn't create a novel landscape, but it accelerates the future. And so as we look forward to figuring out what's going to happen in 24/7 renewables, the question is, well, what are the monetization mechanisms for this? I'll start with a bit of a eye chart here. So as we mentioned, there's different ways to describe how you can monetize storage. And for the most part, most of the things you do with regular storage are the same things you do with long duration energy storage. Different long duration energy storage solutions have different technology attributes. Because we have spinning turbines, we actually can take advantage and sell the spinning inertia of our facilities, so that's nice. But if you look at these different bundles of types of things that people can do to monetize, each of these categories breaks down into more specific types of revenue source. And if you look at commercial storage contracts, you'll see we will pay you X dollars for this amount of capacity, or for this amount of capacity, or for this amount of capacity. And one of the reasons I like this chart so much is because these little boxes, which you can't read down here, are you'll be able to read it when we share the presentation. But each of these boxes is a different market. So PJM and SPP and ERCOT. And so if you look at dots here, what this shows is that in storage projects and each of these areas, utility scale storage projects, these markets are capturing these types of values at a valuation that's reflected on the y-axis here. So what you're seeing is in places where people are getting paid for the capacity value of their storage, the amount that people get paid is wildly variable, right? So this guy is getting paid, $10 per kilowatt year for their solution. This guy is getting paid 200. And so if you go through the chart, you see like, wow, it's really all over the map, and different places are valuing these in ways that are highly variable. And this is basically the same chart, but sort of cleaned up a bit. And my favorite part of this whole chart is this right here is energy arbitrage. And energy arbitrage just means you're buying energy when it's cheap, and you're selling it by discharging your system when energy is expensive. And 90% of the time when you talk to people about storage, that's what they assume the value of these storage is. And most of the time we spend with our customers is talking with them about, okay, well, here's, we're going to buy here, we're going to sell there. And that's sort of one part of the economic analysis. What this chart tells you is that actually the arbitrage ends up being a minority component of the total value of these battery systems. It's important, it's critical, but there's a much broader range of storage value drivers than just that. So there's a couple critical things about monetizing coincident renewable energies. One of them is bundling portfolios of green assets, and we've talked about this. We believe that in the last couple of years, you've seen people that build solar and wind assets starting to become storage experts. And we believe that those leaders, in order to survive in the future, are going to have to become long duration energy storage experts as well, because people aren't going to want to buy their stuff if they can't get that supply firmed up over a long enough period of time. We think that the rise of long duration storage assets is going to add a new level of complexity around data management, and specifically around load forecasting and operating these facilities. And that's a software challenge and a very distinct new opportunity in an already nascent but increasingly crowded load forecasting product market. You're starting to see a proliferation of complexity around contracts, and specifically, you're starting to see contracts that have multiple off-takers, and we think that that is going to be a trend that's going to be accelerated, especially with long duration storage. And I think there's going to be some questions that people have as well. Are corporates going to pay a premium for 24/7 renewable energy? And I think the answer to that is maybe, but what's really going to happen is that non-24/7 options are going to be increasingly precluded from bidding access to these projects. And then you just have a more complicated data environment. I'm going to talk for a couple minutes about some specific examples. So Google is perhaps the global leader in this transition point. And in 2012, they made the commitment to going 100% renewable energy. And that was just pure lunacy back when they said it. And it was, to be honest, visionary, and people thought it was nutty to the point of irresponsible. Completely not nutty now. And in 2017, they actually did it. And before they even did it, they said, that's not enough. We don't ever want to use carbon sourced energy ever. And we're gonna create this ecosystem so that we can move our gigawatts of load off this. And the most important part of the Google load is the data centers, because that's where they get the most political flack. It's where they use their most energy, and it's where most of their costs are. And the Google Data Center Challenge is really something that more than any single thing is driving a lot of the transition in this market, because they kind of started this game. This is an illustration of the carbon intensity of Google's Finland data center. And this shows from January 1st to December 31st, every single hour of every single day, how carbon intensive their energy supply is for the data center. And what you can see is that if it's dark green, it means it's 100% renewable energy. And because this is Finland, there's just boatloads of pumped hydro power, and so it's not that hard to do it. And yet even Google has had a hard time getting to be 100% renewable, so all these little gray spots are places where they've had to rely on carbon-sourced electricity. This is the same chart for North Carolina, and as you can see, actually it's much harder in this place because they don't have good enough storage. This is the chart for Taiwan, and you can tell that there is a long way to go. And when you average this out across the entire global Google data ecosystem, you can see there's quite a long way to go. Other corporate entities are hopping on the bandwagon, and that's a very good thing. Microsoft and Vattenfall recently announced that they are actually delivering a 24/7 solution. And they're doing that because Vattenfall has enormous amounts of hydro, and Microsoft has great cloud analytics. And so they're combining those two things to deliver this. It's possible to do that in a Northern European environment where you have just unfathomable amounts of wind and storage. As the system expands, it gets harder and harder to do it with more and more folks that are doing that. Daimler is one of the corporations that's also jumping into the mix, and you're going to start to see more and more of these contracts. And remember, as you scale, you need more and more long duration storage, and you're going to see more and more innovation on the contracting and the financing side. The models are absolutely critical in this process. Big shout out here to CESA, which has a long duration energy storage modeling effort going on, specifically to support California. And there's a bunch of other really exciting modeling things going on. There's a huge opportunity in this space. Just a few days ago, Tesla announced that they are making public their modeling tools that they use for grid modeling, which is very smart. University of California, Merced just won a grant from the California Energy Commission to develop the Resolve model at higher resolution. It turns out that the models that California uses can't accurately predict the operation of storage facilities more than sort of the standard lithium situation. So CEC is working to improve that. There's some other really interesting government, federal and state initiatives to support the challenge of this data problem. And then you can look at companies like Siemens and AutoGrid and Sunrun that are all tackling this new grid storage ecosystem and the data challenges associated with that. A small but really big thing is this issue of what do we call it? We're at the cusp of a really important new dimension to the renewables energy space, and this dynamic is going to absorb tens, hundreds of billions of dollars of capital. And it's going to be critically enabling for the political and corporate goals in front of us. And yet there's no consensus around what it's called. And it seems like we have to kind of figure this out as a community. And I'll gander that I think there's 144 people on this call right now. And I'll bet that represents probably a quarter to a third of the people in the world who have the most direct influence on what we end up calling this as a community. So again, send your comments in and we'll publish it on what we should collectively be calling this. And that's really a lead into my final point, which is this is a really important industry. This is the bleeding cutting edge of the renewables revolution. This is, in our minds at least, the most important technical challenge that is facing our collective ability to truly get to 100% renewables globally and to really slash carbon from our global energy diet. And so we need to get aligned on, what do we call it? We need to collectively pair up with regulators to make sure that the laws and the compensation tools are properly allocated for this. We need to recognize that this is an additional tool in the toolkit, and that we're going to start bundling these types of technologies with lithium, with solar, with storage, with anything else that comes along, and that we have to basically bind together and make sure that we can collectively make this type of solution available for the rest of the folks in the world that are fighting their parts of the climate change thing. And lest this presentation come across as too green or too philosophical, everything that's in here is really, at the end of the day, driven towards project IRRs for projects. Because at the end of the day, the thing that drives technology into the ground, the thing that puts steel in place and gets workers deployed to get out there and build more solar, build more wind, and build more storage, is returns on investment. And this is a sound place for capital to deploy. And so we think that really completes the virtuous cycle that's needed to get where we need to go on this. So with that, we got a couple minutes for Q&A. I've got a long list here. So I'm gonna go ahead and start reading things. I don't know if our video.
We have a couple comments a couple questions in the chat box as well. Just so you know.
Couple questions in the chat box. Okay, I just opened a thing that shows 20 questions. So here's what we'll do. It's 1:57. I'll formally sign off in a couple minutes. Jin is also available for Q&A during this process. Aaron, I think if we go over, we can just go over, right?
We can, but there are other webinars to go to. I'm also recording all of these questions as they come in, so we can send a follow-up text answer later if we want to.
So let's do this. We'll formally sign off in a couple minutes. I'm going to stay on until, and I'll just go through these questions. Feel free to ask me or Jin questions right now through this little Q&A thing or by email afterwards. We'll make the questions available in list form afterwards, and we'll be distributing the presentation, and somebody's at some point might figure out if we've actually recorded this as well. So without further ado, I think I'll just start answering questions. What are the expected lifetimes of storage tanks? These are 30-year assets, and there's a lot of precedent in the industry for long duration storage facilities. There are certain maintenance requirements for the turbo machinery and for the tanks and for the valves and everything else. But it's not like a lithium solution where you have a wholesale replacement every X number of years. I visited Solar 1 in the desert in the 1980s, and I know Solar 2 came later, but they were not financially viable beyond DOE support. They use molten salt for storage also. Can you explain how your non-ground mounted tracking PV style system is more cost effective and reliable? Yeah. So the biggest difference between those solutions is that they came with the energy generation technology, and so a lot of the cost is in the construction and the maintenance on the solar collection mechanism, and in the cost and the conversion of the heat into steam. So we're really the molten salt is really it's a portion of our overall cost, and so we're really taking advantage of the really dramatic low cost wind and solar on the market as our energy supply, and then taking advantage of the cost benefits of the molten salt itself. So in other words, it wasn't the molten salt that was the expensive part, it was the collectors. And in fact, it's the very low cost of solar panels today that has really been the biggest challenge for CSP to scale as a technology. At 100 megawatts on up, so let me just do a check. It's 2 o'clock. It's 2 o'clock, so why don't we sign off? Jin, do you have any other comments or closing questions before we sort of roll back into more Q&A?
Yeah. Let me just kind of close the logistical part of the session. You know, people can feel free to hang on. Just wanted to make a couple logistical announcements. You know, thanks everyone for joining, Ty. This was a wonderful presentation. Clearly, there was a lot of demand for you know, better understanding your technology and how long duration storage fits in. There's a lot of great content here, and you know, I'm happy to stick around as well. Just as a final note for those who are planning to attend the other sessions, we do have a couple of other sessions, one from STEM related to artificial intelligence and how that drives value and reliability in front of the meter projects and how their software solution plays into that. And we also have a panel occurring concurrently by Nostromo that's looking at how behind the meter storage, looking at that landscape and seeing how water-based energy storage technologies fit in to that market segment. And just to kind of, close the official part of the segment, Ty, I just wanted to ask one kind of closing thought in terms of, what is the one major signal that you need to know that, long duration storage has arrived, and whether from a market perspective, regulatory perspective, that really indicates that, long duration storage has a place and has a role, and is commercially ready to really be unlocked.
Follow the money.
Follow the money.
Yeah, follow the money. I think the demand is there. The demand is demonstrably there today. The technologies are increasingly available, and the ultimate test is whether or not you close that loop and finance these things and get them in the ground. So, this work, the LDES ecosystem is going to go through the same transition element that the lithium guys did, that the solar panel guys did, that the wind industry did. It's going to be a non-investable asset until the first investments are made, and then it becomes more investable, and then shortly after that, it's fully investable. So these financings are increasingly happening now, and it just plays out over a number of years. So, yeah, follow the money.
Great. Yeah. With that, happy to close the session, but feel free to stick around. Ty said he would stick around and answer any questions. So for those who do wish to do that, can do so. Otherwise, look forward to seeing you at the other panels. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Why don't we'll do 2 or 3 more questions and then wrap it up, and then do the Q&A. At 100 megawatts on up, community solar facilities also become a probability. What is the likelihood of that in such states as California, but bridges the gap between desert systems and on-site solar? This is a really fun argument around, hey, should solar be in the desert or should solar be on people's homes? And you get a bunch of solar geeks in a bar late night, and this argument will go on for hours. I think the answer is you really need a combination of both. And the combination of both depends on geography, and it depends on the political winds of the day, and it depends on what else is going on. So the answer is you need it all. And what's happening is that the costs are coming down. Different advocacy groups are pushing harder or less hard in each of these environments. And so from our perspective, it doesn't matter, because cheap solar is cheap solar on the grid. And so when the sun's shining and this stuff is overproducing, you're going to have a lower energy cost, whether it's coming from the desert or from someone's house. Is Malta interested in retrofit applications alongside existing power plants for flexibility or power plant life extension? We are deeply in conversations with power plant companies for all the reasons that we talked about before. We're a good transition technology, and our business strategy and our team are very we're familiar with the types of dynamics here. Again, it's our belief that pairing long duration technology with people that own and operate coal plants is net going to accelerate the transition of coal, because you're providing a viable financial alternative, and so you're not forcing people to hold on to these polluting assets as long as possible. So absolutely, collaboration around transition is a great idea. Please compare the alternate solar-powered hydrogen storage for fuel storage for applications such as both buildings and transportation. So we are very much not a building level distributed solution. And again, it's because the advantage that we're capitalizing on for our system design is using turbo machinery, sort of the larger scale turbo machinery. So we're not really targeting the distributed assets. If you look at hydrogen generation, then the efficiency of that conversion process today is not competitive, but is still a good solution for environments where you have an additional hydrogen gas solution, or where you're looking to do, we have a super high premium on seasonal storage. And I'll take one more question here, and then we'll publish the rest of these. We've got about 30 something questions, so that's fun. Europe is looking at repurposing its retired coal plants as energy storage. Could Malta be used for a similar purpose in the United States? We are in conversations about doing that in Europe and in the United States. So yes. So thanks everybody for joining. Thank you, CESA, for putting this all together. Thank you, Jen, if you're still on, for co-hosting. Thank you, Aaron and Matt, for putting it together on our side. Please feel free to reach out. My email is on the bottom here, and we look forward to collaborating with all of you on this exciting journey. So thank you all, and we'll sign off. Thank you for joining.